Well, in a recent video, I introduced some of the most difficult poets in the English language, whose difficulty was in proportion to the amount of enjoyment that they render. And in this video, I want to introduce to you a few poets, 5 of them, who are entry point poets, or gateways into the world of poetry. So if you're new to poetry and perhaps a little interested in seeing what it's all about, these are the poets that I would recommend starting with. And I just want to say, before I begin, that these are not the easiest poets. This is not necessarily a companion to my other video on the most difficult. These poets are inexhaustible poets who I think will inspire confidence in your ability to enjoy and read poetry. And these are poets who many readers have discovered as ways to get into poetry. So we have classic poets and a contemporary poet here, but I want to start with a classic poet, Emily Dickinson, the 19th century American poet. Now, some of you were saying in the difficult poets that Emily Dickinson belonged there. Her poetry is difficult at times. It's dense, it's hard, it's lapidary, but it's always bright, and it's seldom inscrutable. They are like her poems. Her poems are like little walnuts. They're self-contained, hard, round, require cracking, but the work is rewarded greatly. Just take this poem, "The Brain is Wider Than the Sky," as an example. It's a short philosophical poem on the vastness of the mind. And I'll move over to the side so the editor can make the magic appear here. The brain is wider than the sky, for, put them side by side, the one the other will contain with ease, and you beside. The brain is deeper than the sea, for, hold them, blue to blue, the one the other will absorb, as sponges, buckets, do. The brain is just the weight of God, for, heft them, pound for pound, and they will differ, if they do, as syllable from sound. The genius of Dickinson is her word choice, as always. Instead of using the word mind, as you might expect, she says brain. Yet, notice how clinically scientific the word brain is. Yet it's made to hold both the physical and metaphysical, or the spiritual, connotations, as that's often associated with the mind. So the scientific word brain is often used as a reduction of consciousness. It has a certain connotation. You understand what I mean. It's difficult to describe, but here in the poem, the voice of the poem beautifully accomplishes the marriage between the scientific eye and the spiritual vision, and the reality of what it's like to be a mind. And just that last stanza, the brain is just the weight of God, for heft them, pound for pound, and they will differ. Heft means a way to measure, and they will differ, if they do, as syllable from sound. And, of course, her comparisons are incomparable. It suggests this semblance between the brain and what she calls the weight of God. The two are like the relationship between sound and syllable. And a syllable is a unit of spoken speech, which is a kind of sound. So the poem suggests that the brain is a kind of weight of God, something that can be absorbed into it, as this other stanza suggests. This requires deep meditation. This is not something you can just gloss over or analyze in a few minutes. She's not always this philosophical or metaphysical, but all of her poems do demand the kind of working over and settling. You'll have to read this, think about it, come back to it, read it again. So many of her poems are like this. So many of her poems are invitations to meditations, really. So instead of a walnut, her poems might better be likened to a lozenge with a soft center, something that requires patience as their hard exteriors dissolve in order to yield a sweetness in their dissolution. And I think that the Dickinson, her poetry is just amazing in that way. So you're not supposed to understand it all at once. And that's the beauty of poetry, as opposed to short-form entertainment. We're all used to being passive consumers at this point of entertainment. And poetry requires your participation in it. It requires the intellectual activity and the imagination in order to make it work. And that's something that's really beautiful about poetry. Now, another classic English poet is the English Romantic poet, Lord Byron. And I've given Byron an unfair short shrift on this channel, as some of you have mentioned, including my editor, but I expect we'll make a proper study of him on Versed next year. Byron is one of the first celebrity poets. After publishing the first two cantos of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage in 1812, he woke up to find himself famous, as he described it. And he really was. People couldn't get enough of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Let me show you some of the cantos, what they look like. I'm just going to scroll down here. These are Spenserian stanzas, the form invented by the early modern poet Edmund Spenser for his great epic poem, The Faerie Queene. And Byron renews this form just as the Scottish poet James Beattie did, and others had done. But he makes excellent use of the Spenserian stanza. And the poem's melancholy. It's got this great brooding imagery to it. It's got a vivid imagery as well, drawn from Byron's own grand tour of Europe and the Near East, and it's charismatic. The narrator is very charismatic, as Brian was, and it struck a new romantic chord at this time. Just listen to these lines from Canto 4. There is a pleasure in the pathless woods. There is a rapture on the lonely shore. There is society where none intrudes, by the deep sea and music in its roar. I love not man the less, but nature more. From these our interviews, in which I steal from all I may be, or have been before, to mingle with the universe, and feel what I can ne'er express, yet cannot all conceal. By the way, this is from Canto 4. Going on. Roll on, thou deep and dark blue ocean, roll. 10,000 fleets sweep over thee in vain. Man marks the earth with ruin, his control stops with the shore. Upon the watery plain the wrecks are all thy deed, nor doth remain a shadow of man's ravage, save his own, when for a moment, like a drop of rain, he sinks into thy depths with bubbling groan, without a grave, unknelled, uncoffined, and unknown. Absolutely harrowing description of death at sea, and also a beautiful description of the ocean, which I wish were still true today. But it seems that Britain, at this time, weary from the Napoleonic Wars, craved a new kind of hero, someone who was romantic, rebellious, cosmopolitan, and Byron embodied all of that. His readers really couldn't separate the wanderer, Childe Harold, from the poet Byron himself, even when Byron tried to distance himself from his figure, Childe Harold. And this, by the way, is from the opening canto, opening lines of the first canto. And you'll see why readers made this connection between Byron and Childe Harold. So here's the description. Whilom in Albion's isle there dwelt the youth. Whilom, here he is doing the Spenser thing with the archaic word. That means once. By the way, it was an old word in Byron's day too. Albion's isle, that's England. Whilom in Albion's isle there dwelt a youth, who ne in virtue's ways did take delight, but spent his days in riot most uncouth, and vexed with mirth the drowsy ear of night. Ah me, in sooth he was a shameless wight, sore given to revel and ungodly glee. Few earthly things found favour in his sight, save concubines and carnal company, and flaunting wassailers and high and low degree. This is a pretty good description of Byron himself, and people kept wanting to associate the disillusioned wanderer with the poet Byron, and I think for good reason, but there's such a charm to his verse. You'll read Byron and you'll think, I just can't get enough of this. I need to read more of this period. And there's something so catching about Byron's poetry, especially Childe Harold, where the stanzas are lush and musical, but dexterously modulating between the high grandeur to the ironic, and then to the confessional and the personal. It shows just what a great range Byron's verse achieved. Now, the third gateway poet is the 19th century poet Walt Whitman. Oh, there is such a directness, a prophetic directness in Whitman's poetry that becomes prophetic through this abrupt confrontation with the reader. He's doing something new. And if you know about American poetry, if you've read American poetry before Walt Whitman, then you really have a sense of that, of just how new Song of Myself was. Song of Myself by Walt Whitman was first published in 1855, and in the second stanza, or the second part, we should say, you have this passage. It's a very long poem, so I'll move over to the side. Have you reckoned 1,000 acres much? Have you reckoned the earth much? Have you practiced so long to learn to read? Have you felt so proud to get the meaning of poems? Stop this day and night with me, and you shall possess the origin of all poems. You shall possess the good of the earth and sun. There are millions of suns left. You shall no longer take things at second or third hand, nor look through the eyes of the dead, nor feed on the spectres in books. You shall not look through my eyes either, nor take things from me. You shall listen to all sides, and filter them from yourself. You can feel the power of these lines, the unimpeded flow of immediacy and inspiration. It's the repetition at the beginning of successive clauses. Have you, have you. You shall, you shall, you shall, you shall, and other kinds of repetitions. He's very much inspired by the Hebrew poets and the prophets, and you can really feel that energy coming through here. These lines are telling his readers really to look within. It's essentially a fulfillment of Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays Self-Reliance and The Poet. If you were to create a poem in answer to those essays, or a poet, it would be Whitman. Because Whitman's poetry came at a moment when America was trying to was hoping for a genuinely American poet. And American poets, up until that point, had a very complicated relationship with their traditions of the past because, for obvious reasons, their traditions were primarily English. And they were a new country, and they needed to create literature and art that was not entirely based on their English predecessors. And Whitman not only gave America that art, but he provided a manifesto. He provided instructions for how future American artists were to find their own voice. You shall no longer take things at second or third hand, nor feed on the specters in books. As Whitman said, he was simmering, and Emerson brought him to a boil. And that's not to attribute all of his greatness to Emerson, but it is to show how there's a connection there, how Emerson was also looking for the American poet. And Walt Whitman, when he came on the scene in 1855, was saying, "Here I am," which is another very Hebrew phrase. He didn't actually say that, but it works with Isaiah 6. So the fourth gateway poet is Alfred Lord Tennyson, the English Victorian lyricist and epic poet. I used to fill my head with Tennyson until it swam with rhymes, and then I'd go walking in the woods. His lyric poetry is just fantastic. As a lyricist, there is something difficult to describe. It's something a little impersonal. There's a certain austerity to his voice, yet he is a Victorian after all, so that would make sense. But the songs themselves ring with lightness. Just listen to the opening of The Lady of Shalott. Here we are here. On either side the river lie long fields of barley and of rye, that clothe the wold and meet the sky, and through the field the road runs by to many-towered Camelot. The yellow-leaved water-lily, the green-sheathed daffodilly tremble in the water chilly round about Shalott. Willows whiten, aspens shiver, The sunbeam showers break and quiver in the stream that runneth ever by the island in the river, flowing down to Camelot. 4 grey walls at 4 grey towers overlook a space of flowers, and the silent isle embowers the Lady of Shalott. Underneath the bearded barley, the reaper, reaping late and early, hears her ever chanting cheerly, like an angel singing clearly, o'er the stream of Camelot. Piling the sheaves in furrows airy, beneath the moon the reaper weary, listening whispers, "'Tis the fairy Lady of Shalott." The little isle is all enrailed with a rose fence, and overtrailed with roses. By the marge unhailed, the shallop flitteth silken sailed, skimming down to Camelot. A pearl garland winds her head. She leaneth on a velvet bed, full royally apparelled, the Lady of Shalott. I mean, just the modulation of pace, the lightness that the lines can adopt, the skipping of the stream, the sibilant sounds like wind in the overshadowing bowers are all part of the intoxication that his poetry can produce. It's an amazing effect. But he's also a great narrator and an epic poet. So when I first read his epic poem, The Idylls of the King, I read it too young. I was 16, I think, and I thought it was a bore compared to his lyric poetry, but that judgment was premature, as was my reading of it, because there is something truly glorious in Tennyson's Idylls. Just take this passage. Let me just show you this passage here. When the dying King Arthur tells Sir Bedivere to return Excalibur, the great sword, to the lake. But now, delay not, take Excalibur, and fling him far into the middle mere. Watch what thou seest, and lightly bring me word. Arthur wants to return Excalibur to the Lady of the Lake, which he promised to do, and he will know that Bedivere did it if Bedivere comes back and reports that an arm reached out and grasped the sword and took it back down. But Bedivere doesn't understand all this. So to him replied the bold Sir Bedivere, "It is not meet, Sir King, to leave thee thus, aidless, alone, and spitten through the helm. A little thing may harm a wounded man. Yet I thy hest will all perform at full. Watch and see, and lightly bring thee word." So he says he's going to go, he's going to do it. So saying, from the ruined shrine he stepped, and in the moon athwart the place of tombs, where lay the mighty bones of ancient men, old knights, and over them the sea wind sang shrill, chill, with flakes of foam. He, stepping down by zigzag paths and juts of pointed rock, came on the shining levels of the lake. And here's the moment of truth. There drew he forth the brand Excalibur, and o'er him, drawing it, the winter moon, brightening the skirts of a long cloud, ran forth and sparkled keen with frost against the hilt. For all the haft twinkled with diamond sparks, myriads of topaz lights and jacinth work of subtlest jewelry. He gazed so long that both his eyes were dazzled as he stood, this way and that, dividing the swiftest mind in act to throw. But at the last it seemed better to leave Excalibur concealed there in the many knotted water flags that whistled stiff and dry about the marge. So strode he back slow to the wounded king. I just love that description of the winter moon brightening the skirts of the long cloud, the sword dazzling in the moonlight, and the protraction of that description of the sword Excalibur prolongs our own gaze upon it, and we feel with Sir Bedivere the difficulty of this errand. And the greatest think about it, it's the greatest token of the greatest king who shall soon pass away, leave nothing behind, should it be so wantonly discarded and cast aside? That would be a tragedy. And we feel that logic too. And so he cannot do it. And we feel his reluctance. So he hides the sword and returns, and notice how that last line plods like a guilty mind. So strode he back slow to the wounded king. The monosyllables there in the beginning, and then all of the words, many of the words, heavy with a long vowel sound, and the repetition of that mournful O sound, and so strode, slow, performs. All of that performs what Bedivere feels, and it takes a poet of genius to write something like that, and such a poet was Tennyson. Now the fifth gateway poet is the American poet Mary Oliver, who recently died. She died in 2019. And if you are completely new to poetry and find the genre difficult, I would actually begin with her poetry. Her poetry contains vignettes of sustained devotional attention to the natural world and the inner life. As I see her, she's in the company of Henry David Thoreau, Whitman, Dickinson, even Gerard Manley Hopkins, to a certain degree, Robert Lowell, Rainer Maria Rilke, and Annie Dillard. If you know any of those poets or a couple of them, then I think you'll have a good sense of what kind of constellation Oliver belongs in. All of these poets and writers celebrated the holiness of everyday life, and we're actually going to be studying the poetry of Mary Oliver on Verse Community in November, so if you're interested in that, check out the link below. She is inspired by the Romantic tradition. Unlike Romantic poetry, Oliver's verse doesn't flinch away from the more visceral realities of nature, what Tennyson called nature red in tooth and claw. And many of her poems are good examples of this. Her poem, The Real Prayers Are Not the Words, but the Attention That Comes First, is a good example of this. And here it is. The little hawk leaned sideways and, tilted, rode the wind. Its eye at this distance looked like green glass. Its feet were the color of butter. Speed, obviously, was joy. But then, so was the sudden, slow circle it carved into the slightly silvery air, and the squaring of its shoulders, and the pulling into itself the long, sharp-edged wings, and the fall into the grass where it tussled a moment, like a bundle of broken leaves, and then, again, lifted itself into the air, that butter color clenched in order to hold a small, still body. And it flew off as my mind sang out, "Oh, all that loose, blue rink of sky, where does it go to, and why?" The poem fixes the attention upon the little hawk, and that attention awakens our admiration and our sympathies for the hawk and its attributes. Its dexterity, its swiftness, sharpness of its eyes, and its sympathy with the wind. But then we are reminded that those very attributes which awakened our admiration are the instruments of necessary death. The logic here is to say that yes, speed was joy, but yet so was a sudden slow circle that it carved. Notice the imagery there becoming violent. The silvery air, the shoulders squaring, the pulling of itself into the long, sharp-edged wings. It's like the creature and all of its attributes becoming like a weapon. And you see this in Hopkins, and you see this with other poets as well. And then notice that enjambment there, where the butter color is clenching in order to hold a small comma still. And you have the white space, that's called the enjambment, where a line ends without punctuation, causes the mind to hold the sense while the eye moves to the beginning of the next line. And you get to body. A conscious use of enjambment, which then in turn awakens our sympathy for the kill. And it's that tension of sympathies that people often feel when viewing nature, especially these aspects of nature. And then the speaker emerges in the poem and breaks into utterance with that question that turns the attention above to the beautiful impersonal beyond that silently arcs the pivots from life to death below. All that loose blue rink of sky, where does it go to and why? And her poems don't settle questions. They present the tensions and I think leave them unresolved. She's not trying to create a neat aesthetic vision, but she's very much interested in the tension that she herself feels, I think, as a poet in seeing something like this, because she's certainly the poet that feels for the small, still body and also for the little hawk. Now, a lot of academics and literature bros like to scorn her, but I think she really is a skilled poet, and one that deserves attention from serious readers, which is why in November we'll be studying Mary Oliver, and I think she's a great opportunity to get into poetry for people who find poetry maybe a little daunting. And so I hope you'll join us for that. Thanks for watching the video. I would love to hear your own recommendations of poets that you would add to the list, so please leave those below. Thanks for watching, and until next time.